Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Trevor McKay, and I am the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event featuring Dr. Yuval Levin to speak on the Constitution and national unity. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 700 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a Buckley Fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I want to also emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you here today respect the right of our speaker to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us and upholding the value of free speech. And now for this afternoon's guest. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. At AEI, Dr. Levin and scholars in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Research Division study the foundations of self-government and the future of law, regulation, and constitutionalism. They also explore the state of American social, political, and civic life, focusing on the preconditions necessary for family, community, and country to flourish. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy staff under President George W. Bush. He was also executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy, most recently, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again, which I encourage you all to please grab a copy in the back if you haven't already. He also holds an MA and PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yuval Levin to Yale.
Thanks very much, Trevor. I appreciate that, and thanks to all of you. It's always a pleasure to be at a Buckley Institute event. The Buckley Institute, I remember the excitement around it when it got started in 2011. It does such fantastic, important work. It's always great to be part of what it does. I've gotten to do some teaching through Buckley, do a bunch of events like this, and also met with Buckley students in DC. It's always impressive to see the quality of the students, the quality of the programming, so thank you for involving me in this. I'm going to talk about my new book, as you've generously invited me to do, but in the conversation that follows, I'm also, of course, happy to talk about anything else. This is obviously a very interesting time to be engaged with American politics and with constitutional questions from a variety of angles, so there's a lot to talk about, and we can take up any and all of it in the Q&A. But let me first and foremost, in talking about the book, lay out for you why I think this is a good time to be thinking anew about the American Constitution, to be grateful for it rather than angry at it, to appreciate it rather than just being frustrated with it. The core of the book is really an argument that may sound a little odd in this moment, that the Constitution is an essential framework for national unity in American life. I say that might sound odd because we are in a very divided time, and in a lot of ways, the Constitution is perceived by a lot of people, and I think both on the right and the left in different ways, as a kind of source of division, a force that pulls us apart, that prevents us from having a functional democracy. A lot of the most intense fire and venom that's directed at the Constitution, especially from the left, tends to present it as being, to present itself as being a kind of defense of a public whose will is being denied by the rigidity of the American Constitution. The Constitution's critics tend to accuse it of being too simple, too backward, too naive to work for us in the 21st century. They see it as a kind of 18th century relic that can't serve a more complicated time. And what I want to suggest to you is that that's not just wrong, it's exactly wrong. That whatever its flaws, the Constitution is actually more sophisticated than most of its critics about the most significant challenge that confronts every modern free society. the challenge of cohesion amid diversity, of holding together despite our differences. That challenge of cohesion was very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. It's the first goal that's put forward in the preamble, to form a more perfect union. It's the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers. It was constantly on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. Obviously, unity is not the only purpose of the Constitution. The preamble goes on to list a series of other very complicated and ambitious goals. But unity is a crucial purpose of it, a precondition for the rest. And so the Constitution is in part an answer to the very question that we now constantly find ourselves asking. How can a vast, diverse society hold together and govern itself? So this book is meant to be, in a sense, a kind of reintroduction to the Constitution that emphasizes that potential that it has to unify our country, to hold it together, that shows how its contemporary critics miss some of the most important things about it, and argues that we are divided not because the Constitution is not designed properly, but because we are not abiding by the Constitution. That in this divided era, the Constitution is much more like a solution than a problem to the challenges we face. The book lays out what I mean by that by first helping you see just what the Constitution is, and seeing that in a more than lawyerly way, which I think is very important. The Constitution is law, but it is not just law. It helps you think about some of the characteristic modes of operation of the Constitution, the ways in which it acts to address public problems, the ways in which it shapes public attitudes and dispositions. And then it works through the purposes of its various institutions, federalism and the Congress, the presidency, the courts, the extra-constitutional institution of the party system. It looks at all these in light of the Constitution's prioritizing of national unity. And finally, it thinks about just what unity means when we see it in this light. I'm not going to march you through all of that here, but let me instead offer you a set of 5 quick propositions that I think emerge from considering the Constitution in this light. Propositions that are some of the pillars of the argument of the book and which are now all contested or unfamiliar in contemporary American life. The first of these is really about the nature of unity itself in a society like ours. I think the Constitution is implicitly rooted in a premise that is worth our working out and making explicit for ourselves. You see it especially in the thinking of James Madison, and it is that in a free and therefore diverse society, unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. Americans do have some core commitments in common, also a common history that holds us together, and those are vital. We can certainly talk about what those look like, but our politics is unavoidably about what divides us, and political unity doesn't mean ending those divisions. It means acting together to address national problems despite those divisions and through those divisions. This distinct idea of unity, not thinking alike but acting together, is essential, I think, to understanding our Constitution, because it's an idea that invites a question to which the Constitution offers us a set of answers. I say that unity means acting together, not thinking alike, and that naturally forces us to ask, how? How really is that possible? How can we act together when we don't agree? And that is a question to which the Constitution over and over presents itself as an answer. All of its modes of action, every one of the institutions that it creates, are intended, among the other purposes they have, to answer that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? A lot of what's mysterious and frustrating to many Americans now about our system is a function of its being an answer to that question, of its being designed to enable people who don't fully agree to nonetheless act together on common problems. And how does it do that? Again and again in its various institutional forms, and especially in some of those that we now find most frustrating. The Constitution offers ways of compelling competition and negotiation among divergent factions in American life, driving them towards some common action despite themselves. That's not just a matter of counting heads. Some contemporary critics of the Constitution insist that factional division should just be resolved by simple majority votes and dismiss our system's complicated arrangements of overlapping institutions as undemocratic. But I think the Constitution is more sensitive than they are to the dangers of social division. It certainly accepts the premise that only majority rule can legitimate public action. But it also embodies a very important countervailing premise, unavoidable to anybody who's familiar with the history of democracy or the history of the United States, that majorities can sometimes also act oppressively. And it recognizes that narrow majorities, in particular, are often just ephemeral artifacts of the election system that created them. And so it demands that popular consensus be demonstrated by multiple, durable, reasonably broad majorities that present themselves in institutions elected by different constituencies in different ways. The little tiny sliver majority is not enough to get much done in American life, as we've been learning over and over in the 21st century. And that points really to the second proposition that I'd put to you, that in our system, meaningful policy victory requires broad coalitions, not narrow majorities. You'd think that would be obvious, but if you watch our politics now for 5 minutes, you'd see that it's not obvious at all. Almost everyone in our politics now seems to have forgotten it. Building coalitions through negotiation and competition is often taken now to be a kind of betrayal, a failure of nerve, a turning against your party. Politicians promise to fight for their voters, as they rightly should, but too many politicians and voters, I think, have forgotten what it really means to fight in our system. What it means is to bargain effectively, and so to gain advantage by building a broad coalition that advances your priorities. A lot of politicians behave now as though fighting means refusing to negotiate. But in reality, that's what losing looks like. Refusing to negotiate means giving up the only power you have, because what you win when you win an election in the American system is a seat at the negotiating table. The fact that we've forgotten that is a big part of why our practice of constitutionalism is now so out of whack, and why our politics feel so broken and divided. We incline almost implicitly toward a kind of parliamentary way of thinking that says we won the election and that's it. That's the only question worth asking. That's what's happening in Washington now. There's an implicit sense that only one party matters after the election. But that's not actually how the system works, and every party in the 21st century has had to learn that over and over. It's a problem that's particularly evident in Congress, which is the first and foremost institution of our system, exactly because it is the primary venue for bargaining and accommodation at the federal level. Congress is where the fundamental work of acting together when we don't think alike is supposed to happen. That's why it's particularly disturbing to find in Congress the attitude that negotiating with the other side is a betrayal or a failure. And that attitude has really seeped into a lot of how we think about how Congress works, and even how we think about how to fix Congress where it's broken. There's a lot of agreement now that something is wrong with Congress. There's even a kind of bipartisan community of congressional reformers in Washington, people who meet to talk about how to fix Congress. But I will tell you, as the often token conservative in these conversations, that there is disagreement under the surface, just under that agreement that something's wrong. The question is, if Congress is dysfunctional, what function is it failing to perform? What is Congress not doing? I think most people's answer to that question would be, it's not passing the big legislation that I want to see passed. It's not acting on the big problems, whether you think that's entitlement reform or immigration or the environment or whatever you take to be most important. That is the common view, but I think it's ultimately a mistaken view. It seems to me that what Congress is failing to do is not so much advance big legislation as enable cross-partisan accommodations and bargaining. Now, that's also why it's not passing big bills. But the underlying problem is that Congress isn't doing its fundamental job in our system, which is to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining. What it's failing to do is to enable us to act together where we don't think alike. That difference over diagnosis actually has some enormous implications for prescribing remedies for Congress. If you're frustrated with Congress's failure to advance your favored legislation rather than with the failure to advance cohesion by advancing negotiation, then you tend to call for a more efficient Congress, for eliminating supermajority requirements like the Senate filibuster, for empowering party leaders more, for letting things happen in a more efficient, quick, effective way. You have in mind, again, something more like a parliamentary system. But that kind of model is not likely to lead to durable legislation in the American system. And more important, it would further undermine the capacity of our politics to engage in common work toward reconcilable goals. Reforms have to point in the opposite direction, empowering committees and intra-party factions, not leadership, reinforcing some of these supermajority requirements that are the only reason that there's been any cross-partisan work in Congress at all in the past decade and more. And so that's the third proposition that I'd put to you here. Reforms of Congress should make cross-partisan bargaining more likely, not less necessary. That kind of approach to the problems with the institutions of our government, asking what's the purpose of the institution, and therefore what is it now failing to do, should inform how we think about our system generally. And it could help us think not only about Congress, but about the other elements too, and maybe especially about the presidency. Because I think we're almost as confused about the problems with the modern presidency as we are about Congress now. Like our sense of Congress's purpose, our understanding of the executive is dominated by a kind of progressive prioritization of policy action over the Madisonian prioritization of political order and social cohesion. In fact, we think about the presidency now in very legislative terms. We think it's a representative institution and that its purpose is to advance the policy agenda of the party that won the last election. That's obviously part of the story, but it's not the heart of the story. The presidency is a unitary office. It can't be representative of a diverse society, and it's an administrative office. Certainly, the president is intended to have a role in driving the agenda of our national politics, in putting some key questions on the table, setting priorities. The Constitution lets the president veto legislation, lets the president propose legislation. But the kind of bargaining and accommodation through which policy is ultimately supposed to be made can't really happen within the office of the president. That means that the president can't advance unity by assertive policy action either. The distinct role that the president has in advancing national cohesion, along with his other roles in the system, his particular role in advancing unity has to do not with energetic policy advocacy, but with what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration. Contemporary presidents, because they value their ability to drive policy action most, essentially try to do the work of the legislator when the legislators won't. They have dramatically underemphasized steady administration. What every president spends half of his time undoing his predecessor's administrative action, and then the other half taking actions that his successor is going to undo, we lose the steadiness that's essential to a free society. We move back and forth, and our elections leave us with a sense that nothing is stable, that nothing is steady. But steadiness is extremely important to the functioning of a system like ours. It's what gives people the security, the confidence to take risks. It's what gives us the sense that we know where policy is headed, that we know what to expect, and we can act accordingly. We now don't really have that sense, and a lot of the reason for that is the way that we've thought about the modern presidency. And the effect of that is not just bad for administration, but also for national cohesion. It dramatically raises the stakes of our elections, and therefore the temperature of our politics, because it means that key questions don't get resolved by bargaining and coalition building, but by sharp turns and hard stops. Everything depends on who the president is. And so my fourth proposition to you, the fourth implication of looking at the Constitution through this lens of national unity, is that reforms of the executive should prioritize steady administration over assertive policymaking. That's the way to think about the nature of the modern administrative state. That's the way to think about how to change the powers our presidents exert. If you watch the news today, you will see that that is not how we are thinking. There's a lot of room to change how we understand the role that the president has in our system, regardless of who the president is at any given time. And finally, when it comes to the third branch, the courts, I don't think that an agenda of reform is exactly the way to think about what's needed. The courts obviously have a crucial part to play in advancing unity too, but it too is not exactly the part that we imagine. It's not rooted in their ability to resolve disputes. Courts do resolve disputes, obviously, that's what they do. But they're intended to resolve disputes over what the law is, not what the law should be. And so they're not ultimately the right venue for mediating among competing visions of the public good. Great public disputes have to be resolved through the work of the legislature above all. The most valuable service that the courts provide to the cause of national unity is in their policing the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism. Their restricting of the power of majorities and of public officials to pursue various kinds of end runs around the structure of our system. The courts, in a lot of ways, have actually been improving on this front. And I would say, unlike both of the elected branches, the courts are now closer to serving their proper constitutional purpose than they were a generation ago and 2 generations ago. They do need more of a focus on constitutional structure rather than on the policing of personal rights. But the transformation of the courts in this century has, I think, been very much to the good. So when it comes to the courts, the fifth proposition that I'd put to you is a function of that transformation. And it is that the lesson of conservative successes in the courts is that we should fight for the Constitution and not against it. Conservatives, constitutionalists, had every reason to give up on the judiciary in the second half of the 20th century. But rather than give up on it, they set about renewing its commitment to its proper purpose through a very long-term project of reform that started as intellectual work, that then evolved gradually into institutional work, supported by political action, that enabled a genuine transformation of the judiciary. It was a kind of labor of love, love of the Constitution, love of the country. And I think that is exactly how we should now think about the constitutional challenges that we face today. We are, with regard to fixing Congress in particular, which, as I've suggested, I think is the most significant of the constitutional problems we face, we are roughly where the right, at least, was regarding the courts in the mid-1970s. The idea that we could reform Congress to do its job again, that we could recover a sense of the proper roles of the different institutions of our system more generally, may seem hopelessly naive right now. It's not where things seem to be headed if you watch the news. But it's not more naive than the notion that Robert Bork here at Yale Law School or Antonin Scalia and others had about how the fundamental philosophy that guides the work of judges could change 50 years ago. There was a kind of strategic naivete to what they were doing. They began by believing it could work and then asked themselves how. And I think you have to be a little naive about what you love most in life. You're not a cold-eyed realist about your spouse or your friends or the Mets, or at least you better not be, because it's not going to work out well. You have to be just a little bit naive about what's possible. And I think we have to think that way about our country, too. Not so naive that it makes you optimistic, but naive enough to be hopeful, and so to fight for the Constitution rather than fighting against it. For me, writing a book like this, going around giving talks like this, is, among other things, a way of forcing myself into that kind of position of slight strategic naivete. Most of the questions that I get about this book are basically forms of, wouldn't it make more sense to just despair? I mean, look at Congress. Look at the presidency. Look what we're doing. Obviously, it's more plausible to think that this is not going to work out. Maybe you're going to ask me a set of questions like this in a minute. And they're not crazy questions. Our system is definitely confronting some very serious challenge. There are certainly days when, looking at Washington, I think this way myself. But ultimately, the answer is no. That's not true. That's not justified. Despair is not the most realistic way to approach America's future or to approach our Constitution. I don't think there's been any moment since 1776 when it would have made sense to bet against the United States. And it certainly doesn't now either. We've got a lot working for us. We've got a lot of reasons to believe in the future of our system and our society, and we've got a lot to work with in the nature of that system and the nature of this society. Ultimately, that suggests that our attitude about the Constitution, even where we're frustrated with it, even where we see problems that clearly need to be addressed, should be an attitude of repair. We should see that it is worth our work to fix these institutions, that we can't give up on them, we can't put ourselves outside and say this is something those people in Washington do and it's never going to work. It's something we all do, and it has to work if our country is going to have the kind of future it deserves. The Constitution was intended precisely to address the kind of problem that we now face. It's up to this moment. I think the bigger question is whether we are up to this moment. And I guess I would say I hope we are. And this book is, for me, an expression of that hope, an expression of a certain kind of gratitude for the system that we've gotten to inherit, and a set of ideas about how we might bring it back to itself and help us have a better functioning politics. I'll end there. I'm glad to talk about anything you'd like.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Levin. I really appreciate your remarks. Thank you for coming to Buckley. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the primary system. Do you think the primary system, obviously not in the Constitution, but do you think it's the kind of small r Republican institution or tradition that the founders would have liked or something they would have seen as a good addition to the party system?
Yeah, thank you. I think the primary system has to be thought about in the context of the party system, right, which is also not in the Constitution. And in fact, the framers of the Constitution, to begin with, were pretty hostile to the idea of permanent parties and of a party system. They were hostile to it until the minute they started actually working through the constitutional system. And as soon as it got going, they realized we need some way to organize the politics of this system. And what was required was a way of organizing especially the process of candidate selection to create some functional way to allow broad sets of views in the public to be expressed and to allow politicians to work together when they're elected, too, and to be governed, to create boundaries so that there can be negotiation across those lines and within factions. that's the role that our party system plays. It emerged very gradually and grudgingly. But the party system that we have, I think, is a fairly good fit for the constitutional system. It's taken shape as a two-party system, very unusually. The United States stands out in this way from most democracies. That's happened as a result of the nature of the Constitution, especially because of the character of the Electoral College. You have to win an absolute majority of electors to win the presidency. And so if there's more than two serious candidates, it's likely the election will go to the House. And that happened twice, in 1800, 1824, and everybody decided it can't happen again. And it hasn't happened again because of the two-party system. The role the parties play in that system is especially candidate selection, that is filling the electoral ballot with people who are up to the job and who in some way represent the various factions that constitute the party coalitions, and then allowing for some coordination of resources in the seeking of public office. In the last half century or so, the parties have gradually turned over both of these roles to the broader public in one way or another. The primary system, first and foremost, turns over the role of candidate selection to what is by now really an almost random selection of people who just happen to show up on primary day and then get to choose who runs for every office in our system. Over the last 10 years, and we can now include the 2024 election because we've got data on primary turnout, the proportion of voters that turned out in the primary was about 8% of the overall electorate, a very small sliver of both parties. And they tend to be the people who are most ideologically committed, most ideologically rigid, we might say. They tend to be the people who least want to see a politics of bargaining and accommodation. And in a sense, we start every election process by asking the craziest people in America, what would you like? And then we do what they would like, and we're surprised that our politics looks like it's full of crazy people. The primary system has turned out not to be a good fit for contemporary American political culture. I don't think it's impossible for it to work, but I think it can't work now. Now, we're not going back. We're not going back to a system where candidate selection is done by local party committees. Those basically don't exist anymore. We're not going back to a system where it's done by an actual convention of party elites. I don't think that's how either party wants to do things now, and that's good. But I do think there are ways to go forward in a way that could allow the two parties to get out of the rut they're in by selecting more broadly appealing candidates. To do that, the parties would have to see that they're in a rut, and they are. The 21st century has seen a kind of breakdown of the party system. We have not had a durable majority party in American political life since the 1990s. So an entire generation now. That's very unusual. If you look at America at almost any other time, you'd find a majority coalition working very hard to hold itself together, a minority party trying to broaden itself and build out the coalition. Both those parties are engaged in coalition building. Our two parties are both minority parties now. They're both focused on getting out their most devoted voters rather than broadening their appeal. And that means neither of them is really engaged in coalition building. They lie to themselves about this after every election. Whichever party wins says to itself, well, now we're a huge coalition. And we've done it. We've shown that we can do it. We won this slice of that demographic. The fact is, we've had 50-50 elections, one after the other. This last election this month, amazingly, California is still counting votes. Don't tell me how that can be. But they're just about done. And it looks like in the end, the winner of the election, Donald Trump, is going to have won 49.7% of the vote. The loser of the election, Kamala Harris, will win about 48.2% of the vote. That's a really close election. That's a popular vote, doesn't necessarily tell you, but it's close in the Electoral College. We're going to have the narrowest House majority in modern American history, narrower than we've seen since before we had 50 states, and a relatively narrow Senate majority. I think it's just crazy for Republicans to tell ourselves, well, now we've done it. We've built the big majority. I wish that were true, but it is not true. The work of doing that is still ahead of both parties, and seeing their way to it, I think, does require some way out of the contemporary primary process. That could involve various ways of complicating the ballot. I think there's room to talk about ranked choice in primaries. I don't think ranked choice is a good idea in the general election. It weakens the parties. But experimenting with that kind of thing, experimenting with state-level conventions, with various ways of combining elite decision-making, and popular voting. It has to be mostly popular voting, but the question is, who is the party? And I think the parties have done a very poor job of this for themselves, and they're paying a price for it. We're all paying a price for it. The system gets populated by people who are not well equipped to do the jobs assigned to them in the Constitution. So I'm not a fan of the contemporary primary process. I think it's behind a lot of the problems we face, and it's one of the things that ought to be reformed.
Thank you for. Oh, yeah. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask about the inequality built into the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm a California resident. In the Electoral College, my vote is 1/5 of that of a Wyoming resident. In the Senate, it's about 1/50th.
Yeah.
Moreover, lifetime tenure means that Supreme Court justices are vulnerable to what's functionally bribery. I don't have the resources to send Clarence Thomas on a $500,000 vacation. I'll let you know if I do, but in the meantime, there's obviously a vast discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots of citizens. So my question is, given that this is bad for democracy because it expects citizens who are supposed to be equal to accept a status of inferiority, do you see any ways to amend or change either the Constitution or the interpretation of the Constitution to reduce inequality and thus increase democracy?
Thank you for the question. I do disagree with the premise in a way that I think I should articulate for you. Well, first of all, I don't think bribery is right. I don't think the justices on either end of the court. I don't think there's any case you could point to where you would not have been able to see how a justice would rule based on the substance of the decision before them in the last half century at least. But beyond that, the Constitution certainly puts democracy front and center. It certainly begins from the premise that majority rule is an essential principle of political legitimacy. But it also sees the ways in which majority rule can deform a free society, in which majorities can be oppressive, simply put. There have to be constraints on majority rule. And there's no simple way to do that, because you don't want minority rule. You want majority rule that is constrained, where it isn't simply easy for a majority's momentary whim to become oppressive of a minority or of an individual. The Constitution does that by creating competing power centers. So you have majority rule, but it takes somewhat different forms in different places. It empowers majorities that show their preferences in different ways. It empowers different kinds of majorities in different parts of the system. Federalism allows for decisions to be made in different ways so that the same question can be answered in different ways at the same time. California and Wyoming are pretty different. They're governed in different ways, and their populations want it that way, and it's very important that that be possible for them on most of the significant kinds of questions that confront government. It's not possible on all questions. There are problems that cross state lines. Commerce crosses state lines. Environmental issues do. Obviously, the national defense is a national issue. On those kinds of questions, we ultimately distribute power in ways that create competing majorities. So the House and Senate are elected in somewhat different ways. Now, they're not as different as they used to be, right? The Senate used to be chosen by state legislatures. And so in that sense, really represented state values. The Senate now is also elected directly by the public, but in a different way, in a way that tries to push back against the power of dense population centers in our system. And what you find in the ways in which the generation of the framers thought about this question was the assumption that there would always be some competition between areas of kind of packed density in American life and more what we would now think of as more like rural America. That the cities and the larger states, as they thought about it then, would be powerful in every realm of American life. And it was important that there be some counterforce in our political system. And you see that in the way in which Congress is selected. The House is selected simply by population, so a voter in California and a voter in Wyoming have roughly the same power. The Senate is elected differently, and it is elected in a way that gives the party of rural America a little more power. Sometimes that's the party of the left. It's actually been the left most of the time in American life that's represented rural America. Sometimes it's the right, as it is now. And there's no question that that does mean that there's some advantage in the Senate, that there's a mild advantage in the Electoral College that really presents itself in very, very close elections. I mean, even this last election wasn't that close that it had that effect. But we did see it in 2016. We saw it in 2000, where the winner of the popular vote is not the same as the winner of the Electoral College. And so the winner of the popular vote doesn't become president. The purpose of these institutions is to try to find some balance between majority rule and minority rights, and to try to find some balance between the different kinds of regionalisms that are represented in American life. It's not a simple matter. I would not say that it's done perfectly, but I think that to avoid doing that altogether would be a problem for our society and would very much exacerbate the tensions that we already do confront, the kind of elite popular tensions that leave people feeling like their interests and their views are not sufficiently represented in American political life and in American culture and elsewhere. I don't think there's simply a way to resolve this problem. So I'm not suggesting that you're wrong about this. I'm just suggesting that anytime you think about political reform, you have to ask compared to what. And so when we think, for example, about the Electoral College, we can certainly point to ways in which it is not ideally designed. But again, compared to what? I think compared to a popular vote, the Electoral College serves us much better, given our divisions. In a popular vote national election for president, the parties would focus on where they're strongest. You'd try to get as many Democrats out in California as you could, as many Republicans in the South. They wouldn't have an incentive to talk to each other. They'd have an incentive to talk to their most devoted voters. And at the end of the day, the divisions we have would grow rather than lessen. Because in order to win the presidency, you have to focus on states that could go either way. That means both parties have to focus on the areas where they're least comfortable, on the voters that are least comfortable with them. And ultimately, that's a little better for our politics. Almost no democracy chooses its chief executive by direct popular vote. The parliamentary systems do it in a much less democratic way than we do, right? The majority of the majority in parliament determines who the prime minister is. So in Britain, that's about 260 people who all went to the same 2 universities. That's a lot less democratic than the Electoral College. But it's trying to solve the same problem. I think that our system, which is basically 50 popular votes, the results of which are then weighted by population, is better than that, but less than ideal. I think there's no way around that. Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, you first. Yeah, I didn't see the mic.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What are your opinions on the impact of the 17th Amendment on the weakening of state-level politics? I think you brought it up as regionalism.
Okay, I love that question. So I talked about this a little bit. The 17th Amendment has to do with the election of senators. Originally, the selection of senators was left up to the states. And just about all the states, there were 2 exceptions in the 19th century, chose senators by having the state legislature vote on who should be the state's representatives in the U.S. Senate. It's actually important to see that when we think about 19th century America, because a lot of the politics of Senate election took place at the state level. Think about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates happened not in the presidential election, but in the election for Illinois' Senate seat 2 years earlier. And the people listening to the debate weren't even voting. The voting was going to be done by state legislators. And everybody pretty much knew the outcome because they were voting by party. The politics of the Senate were quite different in this situation. I think that a lot of Americans came to the view that what resulted from this was a national politics that was not representative enough of individual voters. And part of the progressive agenda at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, along with the personal income tax and various changes to state-level constitutional structures, was to change the way the Senate was elected to a direct popular election in each state. I do think that was a mistake, but I don't think it's a mistake that's really worth the effort it would take to fix. I don't think you can persuade people to go back to state legislatures choosing senators, and I don't think now that it would change all that much. So that if I were thinking about where should we direct our energy when it comes to political reform, I probably wouldn't think about having the state legislatures choose the Senate again. It did have an effect on federalism. It did have an effect on state-level politics. But I don't think it's the biggest problem we confront now, so it wouldn't be where I would start, if that makes sense.
I'd like to just follow up. This is absolutely wonderful, by the way. But follow up on gentleman's from California, the honored representative from California's question. With first an observation, one election you didn't mention was the election of 1860.
Yeah.
If 1860 had been decided by popular vote, Breckinridge would have been the president, and slavery would not have been abolished. Sure. So there's a good reason for the Electoral College. You at least had to have representation across most of the country, and which brings me to one of my pet peeves right now, see if it's how you feel about it, the interstate compact for the Electoral College. Yeah. If that were in effect right now, California, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, all would have had their votes negated, and their electoral votes would have gone to Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think that that compact, which basically is an agreement among the states that says that once enough states have signed on, the electoral votes of each state would go to the winner of the national popular vote. So it's essentially a way to undo the Electoral College by an agreement of the states. Not enough states have signed on to make it a change to the Constitution. You could do this. If enough states did, an interstate compact actually does become binding federal law. I think that it arises out of a sense that Democrats have had in the 21st century that the Electoral College always works against them, and that we're going to end up in situations where a lot of the time the winner of the popular vote won't win the Electoral College, and that the winner of the popular vote will be a Democrat, the winner of the Electoral College will be a Republican. I just think all of that is incorrect. The Republicans' Electoral College advantage is weakening, not strengthening. Just as a function of the movement of population. The same is happening to the Republican advantage in the Senate. There's been a Democratic advantage in the Electoral College at different times. That happened in 2012, for example, in a pretty big way. And I don't think it makes sense to think in those terms. That is, to have an election that's fought out as an Electoral College election, but then you look to the popular vote as the actual result, doesn't make any sense. The popular vote result is just essentially an incidental byproduct of the actual election. If we actually had a popular vote election, candidates would run very differently. They would campaign very differently. They would think about where to find voters very differently. If that's what we want, we should do it. I think it would be a big mistake. But to have an Electoral College election and then treat it as though it was a popular vote doesn't make any sense. And so I don't think we should assign that much value to the popular vote result of our elections in general. And I certainly don't think the interstate compact makes any sense. It's not thought through as a long-term proposition, even for the people who want it. And yeah, ask the people of California, do you wish that your votes had counted as votes for Donald Trump in this election? I don't think they do. At least certainly most of them do.
Hi, thank you for coming. So I think, like, I don't know if you're familiar with some of Professor Samuel Moyne's work, but I think one of the things he notably says is, like, we should just abandon the Constitution. And so one of his arguments for this is that, like, he talks about the paradox of, like, liberal originalism, right? Like, it's how, like, relying on the Constitution to, like, advance, like, liberal or leftist change will always fail because the Constitution is, like, this inherently, like, conservative document, and that, like, what the court has achieved, like, for liberal gains especially, has been when it's acted as, like, a legislative body and less as a less as, like, a constitutional, like, originalist body.
Yes.
So my question is, like, how can we, like, rely on the Constitution to, like, unify us when it does seem like a literal reading of it would mean that, like, it'd make us seem that it seems like conservative. So are we telling the liberals to become more conservative and then achieve this unity, or are we saying that, like, there needs to be some movement by both sides?
I think, again, when you think about something like what Sam proposes, you have to ask yourself, what's the alternative? What do you mean abandon the Constitution? How then do we protect minorities from majorities, right? That's the essential fundamental service that the Constitution as law provides in American life. So what then are the boundaries on a narrow majority that just wants to get rid of basic rights that we now understand as belonging to every individual? If we don't enshrine those in some legal standard that is above the reach of simple majorities, then how are they protected? To say courts are going to do it, I don't know. I don't think that Sam really likes the courts right now, right? Maybe the courts of 15 years ago would have done what he wanted, okay, but what do you do now? So I think even from his perspective, the argument that we should just get rid of the Constitution because it stands in the way of the policy goals that he would like to see pursued is exactly why we need the Constitution. There's always going to be people who say, well, we should just pursue my goals. And sometimes they'll even have the honesty to say that these are minority views, but they're right, so we should do them anyway. The appeal of minority rule, I think, is ultimately leads us in directions that we wouldn't want to see, and unrestrained majority rule does too. So I think what the Constitution allows us to do is to struggle through our divisions in ways that point in the direction of some kind of accommodation. It doesn't always work that way. There's no way around that. Sure, that's true. But it forces majorities to deal with minorities. Sometimes the majorities are on the left and the minorities are on the right. Sometimes it's the other way around. But when you're in the majority, you have to remember that you will be in the minority. That day will come. And whatever power you claim for yourself, you are giving to the other side. And I think the strength of the Constitution is that it's built on the premise that all of us will find ourselves in the minority and so have an interest in some way protecting the prerogatives of minorities. To say that we should just let judges do this instead, that we should just find some small elite of hyper-educated people and let them govern the country, at the very least, is not how I think about democracy. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but one of the things is that I think that you're sort of pointing at is that no matter what, there is a conservative status quo, at least a dispositionally conservative status quo advantage, right? That
oh yeah, no, I don't disagree with him about that. That's right.
So what I'm saying is that how can we propose that the Constitution unifies in this sense when there is it is favoring one side all the time, not all the time, but at least this one disposition all the time. How do we expect a left that is sort of dissatisfied with the state to come and say we're okay with the Constitution and rely on the Constitution to do that?
Again, I think the alternative is to be ruled by a majority they disapprove of all the time. We've certainly seen movement toward the left in public policy in America over time on some issues. We've also seen movement toward the right, right? The public views drift, public views change, and American politics has gone through long periods where it has moved to the left. It's gone through long periods where it's moved to the right. I think the value of the system is that it allows that to happen in a way that persuades as many people as we can that it is legitimate, that the change seems like it was arrived at by some process that I can respect and that asked me my opinion at some point. Doesn't mean I won the argument. Almost no one wins the argument, right? Everybody feels like they gave up something they care about in the process. But the nature of the argument matters. Legitimacy is important. And in many cases, it is just about as important as the substantive outcome. Given that I can't always get my way, it really matters how decisions are made. And I don't think we can give that up because we think that somehow if we did, we would get our way. Whatever side you're on, I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's plausible.
Thank you for taking the time, sir. I just want to know what your thoughts are on, I believe there's a system in California called the jungle primary system. So to prevent extreme primary candidates from happening, both primaries are a popular vote, and then the final candidate's determined by another vote between the top two candidates.
Right.
I was mulling that thought over my head because you pointed out that currently our closed primaries result in a lot of extremism.
Yeah.
But then you also pointed out how we don't want to diminish the strength of the parties. So what would be your proposition for how to actually resolve this?
I think that this is a time for us to be experimenting. And so in that sense, I think it makes sense for California to try something and see how it works. I would say that it doesn't appear to me at this point that it's solving the problem. And what ends up happening in the jungle primary is that the public is left without real options on election day. You end up with a choice between two kinds of Democrats in Northern California, two kinds of Republicans in parts of Orange County, and the range of views even within a congressional district doesn't end up being represented very well. I think the party system works on the whole. And the question we should ask ourselves is how can the parties be stronger as institutions? Because the parties have an incentive to moderate our politics. The parties as institutions have to win in very different kinds of places, right? the Democratic Party has to win elections in Oregon and in Florida. Those are really different places now. And that means that that party has to make room for very different kinds of views. And that making of room is what I mean by coalition building. The nature of the system encourages an attitude of coalition building that helps our politics to stay a little bit closer toward the center of public opinion. So I think the parties on the whole are good. The ways in which we have weakened them, both through the primaries, I would say also through some campaign finance reforms that I think were well-intentioned but very poorly designed, have left us with a system in which outside forces have tremendous amounts of power. They are not accountable in the way the parties are, and generally they don't have an incentive for moderation. The flow of money now comes out of who knows where, and there's no accountability, there's no transparency. That was not the intention of McCain-Feingold, but it was the effect of it. And I think we have to see that and think about how to strengthen our capacity for a more accountable politics. So I don't blame California for trying this. I don't think it was obviously misguided to begin with. I don't think it's working. There are some experiments that seem like maybe they will. I think Alaska is trying something very interesting. I think they're going to keep at it. They put it in front of the public again, and it's coming down to like a 10-vote margin, so we'll see. People are clearly divided about it. But that's an experiment I think is interesting. Wisconsin is looking at some interesting ideas for party candidate selection changes. We need to be experimenting. I don't pretend that I know what the answer is. And when you don't know what the answer is, you have to try. You have to go through trial and error, and that's where our party system should be now, in my view.
Thank you. It seems to me that at the founding of the country, the sort of geographic distinctions of these various different commonwealths sort of played a far larger part in the identity of the Americans. For example, like prior to the Constitutional Convention, one would think of themselves as a Virginian prior to being an American. And it seems that over time with federalism, this has changed a bit. I'm from a more rural part of New Jersey, which probably has far more in common with a part of Iowa than it does with Newark. And so I'm curious if it actually really is the case that sort of geographic distinctions still represent this sort of push against majority rule in a way that perhaps special interests within states would do a far better job at serving those interests.
Yeah, I think that distinction is in some ways always been there. There's a way in which our states now are more distinct, not less, because if you think about the original 13, the states with the largest population centers also had very large rural populations. And so you didn't really have the kind of political sorting by ideology that we see in 21st century America. We didn't really have that sorting even in the second half of the 20th century, right? It isn't always with us. There are times when it is, there are times when it isn't. And so I do think that the system has to adapt and adjust, but the distinction between, I'll put it this way, there's always a kind of left-right axis in American politics. It means different things at different times, but it's recognizable. There's also always a kind of up-down axis, a division between populism and elitism, between the few and the many, which is one of the oldest kinds of political divisions that we know of. The American system is an attempt to represent both the left-right axis and the up-down axis, to allow for ideological differences to be represented, but also to think about the ways in which the economic elite, the cultural elite of the country is just likely to have more power than the rest of the population. And the system does absolutely put its thumb on the scale in favor of the other part of the country, which is generally understood as the more rural part of the country. I think that way to think about it is still of use. It's still of value. It's not perfect. It never was. It certainly may be that it's now less the case that you can tell something about a state based on its population density. But I don't think that's simply so. And I think allowing for both the left-right and the up-down axis to be represented in our politics matters a lot. This is a moment, the time we're living in now, is a moment when that up-down distinction is actually more important than the left-right distinction, right? When populism and elitism is really the question of our political life. And a lot of left-right questions are less salient than they have been for much of our history. These moments come and go. We've seen them before. And I think it's particularly in these kind of moments when those less than simply majoritarian forms of democracy that exist in our system alongside majoritarianism can be very important.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Yes, I have a couple of contemporary questions to ask. What do you think about movements such as, like, I think it's called Greater Idaho, where parts of Oregon are trying to move over into Idaho? And there's a lot of popular discussion going around that Trump has a mandate, as it were, to the to instate what the Republican majority wanted. And in your discussion, you earlier disapproved of that idea by saying these were all very slim margins and it's going to flip back eventually either way. So how would you manage this urge for action as opposed to this need to be moderate, because we know things are going to go back to the pendulum's going to swing again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the question of parts of state joining on to other states is a question that the Constitutional Convention thought about a lot and mostly disapproved of. We have, of course, in our country an unconstitutional state, the state of West Virginia, which was formed in a way that I think was just blatantly in violation of the Constitution during the Civil War. Somebody could sue, I guess. It's a little late. But there is room, with the approval of the state legislature and Congress, for state lines to be redrawn. I think it's very unlikely that Idaho and Oregon are going to do that. But there's a path if there is enough public sentiment there. The second question is very important. I think that it's worth seeing what a mandate would mean in a moment like this. We live in a time of very, very close elections. And it is important to see that this election this month was very close. The kinds of demographic shifts we saw in various parts of the electorate from last time can easily be lined up to give the impression that this was just massive and Trump won everything. But as I say, he won about 49.8% of the vote. That's just not massive. I mean, whatever you think of him, it's not. And it is vital to see that he enters his term with very narrow control of Congress. It's looking like Republicans will have about 220 seats in the House. The president-elect has asked to appoint 3 members of the House to his cabinet, so they're going to have about a 1-vote majority for the first 6 months until those seats can be replaced. The House of Representatives can't work with a 1-vote majority. That means every Republican member is essential to the passage of partisan legislation. So what's the alternative? The alternative is bipartisan legislation, right? And the idea that that's out of the question is, I think, a bizarre kind of 21st century idea. So even into the early 2000s, into the Bush and Obama years, when the president had an initiative he thought was important, he would not just try to line up his own party for it, but would look for opportunities in the other party. There've got to be some Democrats who agree about the border. We know there are. No one's talking about those people. The question is, can we do this on our own? Can we do this on our own so the other party doesn't matter? And all the conversation about majorities is about Republican majorities because there's a Republican president. The answer is no. You can't do this on your own. The Constitution is built in a way that does its very best to make sure that unless you win a very large majority. Look, Barack Obama had a 60-vote Senate majority, and he couldn't do it on his own. So I do think that it's important to see that that doesn't mean the president can't get anything done. It means that he has to think about how to build coalitions in Congress across partisan lines, rather than just think, what can we do by administrative action and hope that it gets through the court, and maybe the next president will be from my party too, so this lasts for 8 years and not 4 years. Rather than think, how do we get everybody in our party, with no exceptions, to line up behind this so that we get the 1-vote majority we need in the House. Presidents have to think in terms of building coalitions. And Congress, too, has to think in terms of building coalitions. Now, that'll mean compromise, right? It means you don't just get what you ran on. It means you get some combination of what voters who supported you and voters who didn't want. That's a feature, not a bug. That's how the system is meant to work. That's a way to build broader support. And I'll say frankly, I don't think things are starting out that way in the wake of the election. And for that reason, I am not optimistic about how they'll turn out. And maybe the trial and error of this will lead to a different way of thinking about how to advance the priorities that Trump wants to see advanced. But he's already done this before for 4 years and didn't leave with that lesson. Joe Biden didn't learn it either. I do think that there's room for the party that sees its way toward the work of coalition building to win bigger than 50% plus one vote. There's no reason why somebody can't win 58% of the vote in a contemporary presidential election in America. It would take a different way of running, but historically, that's perfectly within the boundaries of what's achievable. It's imaginable within modern memory. Now look, I don't think anybody's winning 49 states, as Ronald Reagan did in 1984. That's not happening. We have seen a sorting of the population in a way that makes it unlikely. But could you win 40 states? Of course you could. It would mean running a different kind of candidate in a different kind of way. And neither party is seeing its way to that right now. So I really don't think this is a left-right problem. I think this is something we all have blinded ourselves to about the nature of our system and have to remind ourselves of if it's going to work well again.
Just one last question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in. You mentioned the importance of the steady administration of the president and of that role. And I'm wondering if you think that there are any ways to modify the way that executive agencies work, potentially by getting rid of political appointees, for example, to incentivize presidents to care about that steady administration.
Yeah, it's a very hard question. And I would say that the apparatus of agencies that has arisen around the modern presidency makes it very difficult to think that way about steady administration. The administrative state, what we've come to call the administrative state, is a set of agencies, some of which think they're independent, which is not in the Constitution, to put it mildly. There are 3 branches of government. We have a number of agencies that take themselves to be essentially not accountable, not fireable by the president. I do think that needs to change. The idea that independent agencies are independent has to be rethought by both Congress and the president. But the incentives for steadiness have to be ultimately political incentives. That is, steady administration is durable administration. If you want to make a change that lasts, you have to think about making a change that your successor is not going to have a strong incentive to just simply reverse. That means, first of all, you want to think about legislation rather than administration. Congress has to do a lot more of the governing in our system than it does. And both parties have acted as if they have a reason to pass power over from Congress to the administrative agencies. It's easier for members of Congress not to have to take responsibility. And there's been a lot of that kind of delegation and dereliction. I think the key solution is for Congress to legislate, and to legislate more specifically. But secondly, presidents have to see that there are ways for the rulemaking they do to endure through a subsequent administration if it isn't as simply and narrowly partisan as it is tended to be. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to engage, again, members of Congress from the other party in this process. That's entirely doable. There are ways to think about the incentives of future presidents. You know, one of the most important regulatory changes that we saw in the second half of the 20th century was the creation of the centralized process of rule review at the White House, created by the Reagan administration. It was, in a sense, a partisan move, and yet it was done in a way that thought about the incentives of future presidents. Essentially, it was something that no president would want to get rid of once the president had, right? It consolidated responsibility for rulemaking at the White House. And the presidents that followed, including Democratic presidents, have kept that process. That was steady administration because it was thought through with durability in mind. I think it's a very important facet of rulemaking that a lot of contemporary presidents and the people around them just don't prioritize enough. And the result is what they do doesn't last. And with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Thank you very much.